to say that we are recording. There you go. So, with a couple more people now being admitted and 32 participants, welcome to the beginning of the session. I'm Genevieve Simpson from Race for 2030, and I will be chairing the session for today. All right, at 33 people, let's kick off. Jay, I think you've got the slides, so let's run. Welcome Sam Christie from AEMO. She will be speaking to AEMO and the Integrated System Plan. And Jay Radovitz here is from UTS ISF and has done the research that she'll be speaking to the findings to today. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. I'm over in Perth in Western Australia in beautiful Whadjuk Noongar land, and we would like to have you post in the chat the lands from which you are calling in from today. Jay Radovitz is actually calling in from the UK, so she does not have Indigenous lands to speak of today, but we imagine most of you are calling in from Australia. So we would like to acknowledge the owners of the traditional land, past, future, and emerging, and pay our respects to them. Thank you, Katie Hepworth, for calling out that you are on Gadigal land. The session today is going to have three components to it. We are going to have an overview of race, followed by the integrated system plan, and then go through the results of the modelling methodology that Jay has put forward. And then the results and recommendations are going to be stepped through with a session for questions and answers. While we do have a specific questions and answers section at the end, if you have any clarification questions, please do put them in the chat as the presentation progresses. We will interrupt Jay for those clarification questions, otherwise we will leave them to the end of the session. When we get to the end of the session, we like to keep this pretty informal. 35 participants is a really nice number to deal with, so you should be able to turn your camera off and put up your hand and have a bit of an interactive session at the end. So let's kick off unless we've got any other questions. Thank you. So, electricity sector workforce projections for the integrated system plan delivered by Race for 2030. For those who aren't familiar with Race for 2030, we're a cooperative research centre that brings together industry and our 8 universities and the CSIRO to deliver industry relevant research projects. We have our core industry partners, many of whom are on the line today, in particular state governments, network providers, energy retailers, and providers of energy products. But more broadly, we're interested in having conversations with any industry members who might be experiencing challenges in the energy space. We love to run webinars like these, produce reports which are of value to the energy industry and industry more broadly as part of the energy transition. So our intention is to get to the point where we're approaching reliable, affordable, clean energy by 2030. We are a 10-year CRC running from 2020 to 2030, so our time span is in the title. And unlike some of the other CRCs in the energy space, we are consumer focused. So we're really interested in understanding how people interact with the energy transition. And we want to see our core differences coming through energy cost savings and reduced carbon emissions. The next slide will talk to our research programs here at Race. We have 5 research programs that you see there: business, homes, networks, EVs, and the program that I lead at the bottom there, Race for Change. We have recently gone through a review of our research plan, which has seen this refreshing of themes under these 11 banners. My area under Race for Change looks at the role that consumers play as part of their energy transition. And as part of that, we look at research in terms of trust, consumer perceptions and perspectives. And we've got some really exciting projects coming through in that space, including an expansion on Monash's digital energy futures, which we'll be calling scenarios for future living. That will also hit in our second theme in Race for Change, which looks at how we understand the systems transition. So this includes modelling future energy systems, the models that are required, who has to use them, how they're going to use them, and how we integrate people in with those modelling approaches to understand the socio-technical aspects of the energy transition. But of course, it's no surprise that today's research really sits in that third theme, which is around the workforce planning requirements for the energy transition. As many of you know, this is a really hot area. We can't complete the energy transition without the workforce to deliver it. And I'm excited to see some of our friends in this space on the call today. In particular, shout out to Paring Skills Organisation, UTS, ISF and RACE have been alongside some of our other friends, research partners with them. So looking forward to having good conversations with everyone at the end of the session today on what other emerging workforce research challenge needs are in the space. And with 41 participants now on the line, I'm going to hand over to Sam Christie from AEMO to get into the guts of the presentation and talk about the integrated system.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I reckon we can move along to the next slide. We are here to talk about the way that the 2024 Integrated System Plan results have been delved into and analysed and released by the Institute for Sustainable Futures in partnership with AEMO and with RACE for 2030 to understand the workforce requirements and projections in our sector for the next 20 plus years. The Integrated System Plan is a reporting requirement on the Australian Energy Market Operator. We release it once every 2 years, and it is a roadmap for the energy transition. It identifies an optimal development path for how to reach net zero by 2050, consistent with the transition policies that are in place from the federal and state governments, and also identifying a least cost path through those policies and through the transition. It gives a lot of data and information. We have many appendices. It also has a suite of additional supporting materials, including this incredible projection resource for workforce values. It also does have a regulatory purpose. So through the preparation of the ISP, we do identify what are called actionable projects. Generally, they're transmission network projects, which we see as needing to progress as urgently as possible to support the transition. And they begin once we identify them through that process. They begin their regulatory process, and they skip a stage basically that they would normally need to meet. I think on the next slide, we are giving some context for the 3 different future views that AEMO holds about where the energy sector is going. So we have 3 different versions of the future that we model for in our forecasting and planning documents, including in the Integrated System Plan. We call them progressive change, step change, and green energy exports. They are all internally consistent, feasible future worlds, but they are the different paths that we would take. And a way to distinguish between them is about the scale of Australia's decarbonisation efforts on the way to net zero by 2050. And also another way to distinguish them on the horizontal axis is the energy sector contribution to the decarbonisation efforts. So what must come from the electricity sector in the national electricity market on the East Coast compared to what comes from the rest of the economy to meet the efforts to get to net zero. The majority of results, the way we talk about the Integrated System Plan, etc., are reported for what we call our most likely scenario, known as step change. However, progressive change is almost equally as likely in our view. And also we do have our other bookend scenario, green energy exports, which sees Australia move to being a leader and an exporter in green energy. I think that may be the end of the AEMO slides, and I can hand over to Jay now. Before I do, I'll just comment on this one final slide, which is noting that under all three different scenarios, we see a really large uptake of utility scale wind and solar, and also a really big contribution, 5 times today's contribution, from consumer energy resources, rooftop PV, those kind of assets. You can see in the chart that step change, our most likely scenario, is where we see a 6 times increase in utility scale wind and solar. But we've also put on the chart the kind of additional gigawatts of capacity of generation and storage that we think will be needed on the east coast of Australia in order to meet the other two scenarios as well, progressive change and green energy exports. A huge increase in capacity required to do this transition, and a lot of workers required to do it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam, and that's really great to hear that overview, and good morning, everybody. Or good afternoon, rather. That's my morning. So just before I start talking about the project, I'd also like to acknowledge the team that has been working on it as well as me. So we have Eleanor Gerard and Chris Briggs on the call, but we also have Helen Lara, who's been working on the modelling with me, and Rusty Langdon and Farzan Tahir. And it really is a team effort. And I'd also really like to acknowledge our industry reference group, who really do help us with just making sure we are noticing, that we are producing results that are sensible, and we really value their input, and also AEMO and RACE, who we obviously couldn't do this without. So I won't spend a great deal of time on the methodology because I'm sure most people are familiar with it, but I just wanted to emphasize what the projections actually include. So we are covering jobs in electricity generation and storage, and that's right through from development and construction through to operation and maintenance, and some manufacturing and supply chain jobs. For transmission, it's only the construction of new lines. So this doesn't include all the rest of the work that goes into maintaining our networks, and nor does it include those lines once they become part of the asset base of the network companies. Everything we present is as a jobs as full-time equivalent. So that could be one ongoing job in operations and maintenance, or one person working for an entire year on construction, or 4 people working for 3 months. All of that counts as one job year. And whenever we're presenting the results, what you're looking at is how many people are employed full-time for that year. It's an employment factor methodology. So our key inputs are the energy scenarios and the employment factors. All of this is available in the reports, and in fact in the workbook. This is the first time that we have produced a workbook which covers all the results and also the key inputs that go into it. And you can download that from our site, RACE's site, or AEMO's site. These went out for consultation after the last ISP and have just been updated for the kind of standard productivity improvements. So we calculate decline factors from the cost decline in the technologies. And again, you can find the ones we've actually used in the workbook, and those just come straight out of that we use the cost declines that AEMO uses in their modelling. We think it's important that they are the same ones that we use. Most of our employment factors come from a series of surveys that we did of the Australian industry in 2020, and we supplement those with the literature. But I'm sure that everyone is quite familiar with this as an approach. So I will move on to the results. And these are the results for the 3 scenarios. That's green energy exports at the top, step change and progressive change. And really the key thing to see is this really steep rise up until 2029, where there's a peak in all 3 of the scenarios. And that's really, all of these scenarios are compliant with Australia's targets, and there's a target for 2030. So there's this really steep increase required in the workforce over 5 years. It's challenging. I would say for green exports, it's eye-watering. But even for step change and progressive change, we're going to be needing an extra 33,000 workers in the step change, and even in progressive change, which is lower, there's an extra 19,000. This is really big. So it's good to see that there's a lot of action to try and make this happen, but we really need to, everyone's foot needs to be on the pedal for this. These is just how does this workforce look over the whole period by technology group. So it's the total at the top in the red. Unsurprisingly, renewables are dominating. You know, really that just follows the same exact shape as the total. This is because we're switching to renewables, of course. And this is for the step change, the most likely scenario. Storage employment, which is the purple line, very low base at the moment, but that increases really quite considerably over the time. And by the end of the period, it's between 14% in the progressive change. This is just step change, but up to 25% in this one. And fossil fuel employment declines. So at the moment, it's 35%. And by the end of the period, that's 2 to 6%. I should just say that this is fossil fuel employment in power stations or in the fuel for those power stations. This is not including fossil fuel employment for export. So it doesn't include coal mining for export or LPG. This is having a look at the breakdown by technology. So at the top, that's the dark green is onshore wind and the lighter green above it is offshore wind. That is very big in all the scenarios. So it's about, on the average, it's about between 30 and 38% of jobs across the three scenarios. Distributed solar and batteries is enormous. So the batteries is the light purple one towards the bottom, and the solar are the two, you know, the orange and the yellow. And certainly the distributed solar, the rooftop and the batteries, that's pretty much the same workforce that will be doing that. And that's a really large element of the workforce. And of course, it's spread right across the whole country. Solar farms, a much smaller slice, but growing, so between 8 and 16%. And coal and gas really just decline over the period. So they start quite noticeable. Gas keeps going right the way through. And then you can see at the bottom transmission, which Sam talked about. We really need a big build of transmission infrastructure. And you can see that blue kind of mountain really that we need to get to during this decade of people building those lines. At the moment and through the 2020s, this graph is just by phase. So the brown at the bottom is operations and maintenance. Then the next one is construction and development. The black.
Jane, we just have a clarification question. Any bioenergy considered in these figures, or is it too small?
It's too small, and it actually doesn't appear, or almost doesn't appear, in the ISP modelling. So it doesn't include bioenergy. And yeah, so this one is operations and maintenance at the bottom, then construction, development and fuel. And the top, the sort of teal, is manufacturing. And through the 2020s, construction really dominates because we have that huge build. Operations and maintenance is already 40% of the employment. And by 2033, that's 50% across all the scenarios. And by the end, it's closer to 65% of the workforce. It's not, this is obviously as we have a larger and larger fleet of renewable energy to maintain, this goes up. I mean, this is O&M across all the technologies, but But by the end, of course, it is mostly renewable technologies that are being maintained. Now, this is just, we do a manufacturing sensitivity. So the teal in all of this is the manufacturing. It's a small element of the workforce. And as everyone will be aware, onshore manufacturing is small in Australia relative to the total of manufacturing. We do a sensitivity to see what that would do to the workforce if all the efforts which are being made by federal and state governments to increase that onshore share, if that all comes to fruition. So the graph on the left is the base case, and this looks at for the renewable technologies, this is between 2% for solar, going up to 23% for wind, mostly on wind towers. The conventional fossil fuel and conventional hydro assumes 30% onshore manufacturing. But truthfully, that is so little of the employment because there are no or very, very few new facilities being built. In the enhanced case, we look at onshore wind batteries and pumped hydro going up to 30% and offshore wind up to 19% of manufacturing and solar up to 10%. Now, that looks really small if you look at the total employment, but this is looking at just manufacturing. And if that happened, it would add about 1,200 jobs on average over the period. And while that, again, it's not a massive amount, but of course, those will be very concentrated in the places where the facilities are. And it's a lot of value, so a monetary value associated with it. So it's quite a significant effort. And it would, there would be a peak of about 5,000. You can see that this is quite significant for wind. That's the green bars. And the darker green is offshore wind, although this is it's only increasing it to 19% of the manufacturing employment because so much of offshore wind is at the making end. That's still a very significant amount. You can really see it in the graph, even though offshore wind is, small in terms of overall supply. And this is mostly reflecting the efforts of the Victorian government. So that would likely all be in Victoria. So although it's not huge on a national scale, it would be very big in that state. So I'm now looking just at what does this look like in terms of detailed occupations. And this is really important, obviously, for training, planning. I should say this does not include batteries technologies because we don't have those occupational shares for batteries. And that is significant, that would be significant in this mix because it's a lot of employment. Neither does it include offshore wind. Because that's a small amount overall of employment, it probably wouldn't change them very much. But this is for the, wind, solar, transmission, construction, and coal and gas operation, and pumped hydro, actually. It does include conventional hydro as well, but that's small numbers. So unsurprisingly, because this is average over the whole period, and it's for the step change. Unsurprisingly, trades and technicians dominate, and wind and solar, the color of the bars is what technology we're talking about. That reaches about 16,500 by 2030 and then stays above 13,000 for the rest of the period. This is followed by professionals, then managers, laborers, average about 5,300. And then machine operators and drivers and administrators about the same next. This is now looking at more specific occupations, and we've just picked out 4 that come within the top 8, and I've tried to include some that really follow construction. So the construction laborers at the bottom left. I should just point out, first of all, that they're different scales. The top 2 graphs go up to 10,000. So these are much higher numbers. the bottom two only to 4,000. And through all of these projections, electricians really are the most in demand. Encourage your children to train as electricians. They will never be out of work, and we need them. As you can see, it goes up steadily. And electricians, there's a slight dip after that construction boom, but really they are needed in the operations and maintenance workforce as well. So it just goes up and then it stays up. I'll just mention that, of course, this is not including energy efficiency and electrification. And you'll be surprised to hear that that will also need a lot of electricians. So this is an underestimate. Construction labour is much more volatile, same with mechanical trades and technicians. These will go up and down with the construction profile. Just before we move on to the more of a discussion, so just want to talk, these are based on a lot of assumptions and what they are scenarios, and they are quite a long way into the future. And the one thing we can say is, as we project, it will not be what actually happens. But the primary inputs are the ISP scenarios. So those are the energy scenarios and the employment factors themselves. So both of those introduce major uncertainty because they are about the future. And the further away, the greater the uncertainty. And some things just aren't included because we don't have the data. So, for example, hydrogen production's not in there. The renewable generation to produce the hydrogen is, but not the actual chemical workers who are at the facilities. No occupational factors for batteries or offshore, but probably the biggest emission is we have nothing included on energy efficiency or electrification or energy management. And we will be talking about that again in our recommendations. But so this is a partial view. Just going to do a bit of a comparison with the 2022 findings. So we did do these same projections in 2022, and the graph is showing the solid line is this year's projection, the dotted line is the 2022 projection. You can see we have a much steeper increase during the next 5 years. Some of that is because we've lost time. Some of that is because we have a more firm target for 2030, but we don't have any time to lose to build that infrastructure. If we don't get that steep increase in workforce, we're just not going to make our target. So AEMO did look at a constrained supply chain scenario, and it didn't meet our targets for 2030. That is very challenging, bringing that amount of workforce on to be able to build that. But what we're seeing with the scenarios as modeled is then this huge drop off after we've built it. And certainly we are recommending that we look at ways to avoid that volatility, to bring projects forward following 2030 so that we have a smoother profile overall. There is a slightly lower average in the workforce for this modelling from the 2022 modelling. That's for the step change. And that's really because of the effect of, in modelling terms, of the decline factors. But what that in the real world is reflecting is the productivity improvements that we expect over the period. So to build what we are needing to build, we expect slightly fewer people than we did a couple of years ago. I'll just bring on the this is the graph for the green energy exports. Sorry, it's now called green energy exports. The most similar scenario in 2022 was the hydrogen superpower. You can see it was looking at a great, the projection was for a very much higher workforce then. That's really because for the 2022 ISP, it was assumed that all the hydrogen production would be grid connected whereas about half of it is now assumed to be off-grid. So that workforce is not included in these scenarios. We do a very rough estimation, and if we include that, then, excuse me, it would be really quite similar to last time. There's really significant numbers of jobs right across the eastern states. Obviously, the ISP doesn't include the Western Australia. There are a lot of jobs there too, but they're just not included in this work. And those, they pretty much follow the size of the population. So New South Wales is the highest, followed by Queensland and then Victoria. And the share by technology is very similar across the all but Tasmania. In Tasmania, it's different because there's such a high contribution from hydro, but everywhere else, it's wind, then solar, and batteries. So I'm going to go on to the recommendations now after that little whistle-stop tour of the results. And I think our main conclusion is very similar to what we found last time, except that it is now more urgent. So there is really a major risk that skill shortages could compromise delivery. We're already seeing this around the world, that this is translating into project delays, and this is a global issue. That makes it worse for Australia because we are very familiar with being able to bring workers in. It's a challenging environment to be having to suddenly increase the workforce so sharply. So we have low unemployment, which is a really good thing. It's currently the lowest than it's been for decades, but it, of course, makes it more challenging to find workers for renewable projects. And the National Skills Shortage Priority List identifies a third of all occupations and nearly half of all the professional trade occupations in national shortage. These are a lot of the occupations that we are going to be needing. And there's a lot of competing infrastructure, that are really wanting the same workforce, but often in more attractive situations. So not everybody wants to go and work in remote areas to build things when they could just do it quite near to home. Scaling up training is challenging. It's possible, but it's challenging. There's very specialized needs. It's spread geographically. And now this is the area, it has been subject to high levels of policy uncertainty. I think that is changing. And what we'd like to see is that switches to policy certainty and policy aimed at making that a much smoother pipeline so that those training programs can actually be put in place with certainty and that people can go into the industry with certainty. This is just looking at the boom-bust pattern, and construction is lumpy, but we're looking at really quite extreme. This is just construction here, and progressive change on the left, step change on the right. They're both very similar patterns, just a slightly different scale, reflecting the different amount of infrastructure that comes on. But we're looking at, increases of 27,000 in 4 years, and then the same drop just after that. Surely we can do something to smooth this out. And we really can't push projects back. What we can do is bring projects forward. So at least it's a kind of gentler fall off. And I think we really need to examine this. And this is our first two recommendations, are that the federal and state governments actually look at mechanisms to smooth this development, to try and actively avoid these cycles. And it's really important that that doesn't compromise our emission targets. And that will really be through how the policies like the capacity investment scheme and the policies around developing the renewable energy zones are implemented. And it's probably looking at minimum and maximum targets for each year. And I would say about bringing those ones forward. And we would like to see that in the next ISP that AEMO actually looks at specifically at the cost and emissions implications of what would those policies look like. That would probably be a sensitivity, but I think that would be very informative on policy. Our next recommendation is about actually increasing the labour supply, and this year the Australian Skills Guarantee was introduced for major Commonwealth projects, and this was to introduce mandatory targets for 10% of labour hours to be learning workers, so apprentices, trainees, and with sub-targets for women and for First Nations. And we would like to see that extended to cover all the energy infrastructure projects that have either public involvement or public investment. So that would be the capacity investment scheme and obviously the ones around the renewable energy zones. And we would like to see that also for the Clean Energy Finance Corporation projects and ARENA projects. Our next two recommendations are about enabling the projections to include the demand side workforce. So we'd like to see the development of data and methods to have the employment factors. It's quite a big job, but it's not that it could be done over 6 months, but we think a lot of researchers and industry partners, importantly, should be working on this. And we would like to see in the next ISP that the outputs are modified to enable that. And what this means is that obviously before AEMO produces the energy scenarios, they need demand scenarios. And those include modelling options on electrification and energy efficiency. They are there already. We just need them to be, the outputs to be a lot more detailed and also explicit. So to include what are the savings each year in energy terms, what are the activities that produce those so that they can be modelled. And these are, we would hope that that can be then included in other modelling exercises. So they just become a normal part of the workforce projection. And then our last recommendation is just about overall improving the usefulness and accuracy. And that's really about developing indicators where they're missing. And we also think it's time to revisit those employment indicators for the major technologies. So that's wind, solar, and batteries. This is a fast-moving space, and they were done in 2020. I think by the next ISP, they really should have been just those surveys repeated. So in conclusion, we are looking at good news, really, in that the energy transformation will create many thousands of jobs. The downside of that is that those shortages, if we don't address the shortages, that could actually put the speed rather than the piste and the delivery of the transformation at risk. And there are options to increase that labour supply, which will also increase workforce diversity. So we both need to bring more women into the energy workforce and First Nations people into the energy workforce because we need those workers. But obviously this is a great opportunity. These are good jobs. This is a really good opportunity all around, really. And we need governments, industry and stakeholders really to take coordinated action on this and start bringing on this workforce of the future. And thank you very much. That's all. And I think it's now open to everybody.
Thank you, Jay. We won't start with the easy questions. We've got one question from Brad Smart in the Q&A, which I think it is one that everyone has in the back of their mind. So he explicitly calls out electrical work. Given you are looking at 3 to 4 years for qualifications to start with, ignoring previous experience, even if places where training is available, where do you see those workers coming from within the 2025 to 2030 timeframe, i.e. to meet that 2029 peak?
I'm going to dodge this and pass it to my colleague Chris, who is much closer to this.
Chris Briggs, hopefully will be able to turn his microphone and camera on.
I had a feeling you were about to do that to me, Jay.
Thanks for joining us, Chris.
So I think the answer to that is that in part there's obviously electricians in the pipeline, but you're quite right. It's quite rigid, of course, the qualification. It's a 4-year apprenticeship. There are some pretty heated debates that go on about whether that could be accelerated or not. So in terms of the electricians, I mean, although we've emphasised electricians, I mean, it's important to emphasise that there's a range of workers needed. So if we're talking specifically around electricians, then yeah, you're really talking first and foremost about people who are already in the pipeline or just about to enter it. And some of the key actions involve not just increasing the number of people starting, but increasing the number of completions. There's an issue with the completions of apprenticeships as well. I can see comments firing up here. I can't quite read them though as I speak. I can see Ben's on the line, so I might even pass to Ben. Actually, Ben's Powering Skills organisation is the Skills Council with responsibility and has released a pretty comprehensive workforce development plan. So maybe Ben, you might even like to add comment to this.
Thanks, Ben. Feel free to turn on your camera and your microphone.
All right. Hello, everyone. Ben King, Senior Manager of Workforce Planning and Research at Powering Skills organisation, one of the 10 Jobs and Skills Councils set up by Department of Employment to look at workforce capacity issues. And that is at capacity at the moment. And so one of the things that we're doing is looking at trying to uplift both the capacity of the infrastructure in VET and also the capabilities of the teachers to help train this workforce of the future. But one of the key things we're looking at the moment for our next workforce plan, which will be published in March next year, feel free to look at our current one up on the website. But I think this is pretty salient to the issue that we're talking about here today. And I'll chuck this in the chat. So this is the latest data from where we're going to get the workers. So this is the latest data from Jobs and Skills Australia. And this is not specifically looking at the energy sector. This is looking at skilled recruitment for skilled occupations across the economy. There was roughly 7.5 qualified applicants per vacancy, but only 3 of them were considered suitable by employers. That means they had the skills, experience, and qualification needed to commence the job. So we're looking at a very large chunk of our workforce who have the qualifications, they've completed an apprenticeship, but for whatever reason are falling down in some aspect, whether it's their soft skills, teamwork, communication, digital literacy, or they don't have they need professional development to work on a wind farm, or they need something additional. And so we're trying to unpack that at the moment because, yeah, everyone's right. It's a 4-year apprenticeship and we need people in 6 years. And construction is saying they need more people. Manufacturing is needing more people. So what we're looking at the moment is trying to identify that gap. Where are the qualified workers currently in the labour market? And how can we get them to be considered suitable by employers? How can we upskill them? How can we help them throughout training package development and such to try and fill that gap rather than relying on getting more people in, which is critical, but the timeline is tough, unfortunately.
Thanks, Ben. We might as well make this a bit of a round conversation. We've got Dr. Katie Hepworth, who's the National Policy Director from the ETU, who's also put in a comment around needing to get completions up in this space from around 60% where they are at the moment to 90%. A shout out to ETU who've done a really fantastic piece of work if you're interested in this space as well. It's called Charged Up Strategies for Addressing the Skills Shortage in Electrical Trades. Ben or Chris, did you have any comments around increasing that completions rate?
No, I guess I already mentioned that, that was a key factor. And so if Katie's put a figure around what the ETU estimates is that we would need to achieve.
So, like, that figure comes from NCVER, and like, I appreciate that it has to be uplifted. But some of our key stakeholders at Powering Skills, such as NICA, they report that their completion rates are already at that 90% level.
Really?
So it's a matter of taking like best practice and applying it across. But the data for the vet sector is minimal at best. So for example, if we're looking at skill shortages for vet trainers, it's only available at that. With ANSCO, I can tell you that there's a shortage of vocational education teachers. I can't tell you if the shortage is related to carpentry teachers or unit designers or anything in that. So like that's another thing we're trying to unpack is understanding what vet needs in order to increase their capacity and capability. And then we can provide some best practice because there are examples in the labor market where people are getting to 90%, but it's a tough challenge, unfortunately, as we all know.
Thanks very much, Ben and Chris. I can't see any more hands up or questions in the chat, but while we're talking about data, Jay, you spoke to a couple of the data shortfalls in relation to your recommendations. Brad's just put his hand up. I will finish my train of thought and then we'll pass to Brad. What's from the kind of the high level knowledge that you have of the sector? Where are the largest portion of workers that we don't have sufficient data to be able to measure and map?
Well, it is clearly in the energy efficiency and electrification space. And the issue with that is it is such a big so if we're talking electrification, which is really key to hitting our targets, this is a really varied space. We probably know most about the building sector, that's the best characterized. But this goes right across industry. And truthfully, in every industrial sector, that will be different activities that need to happen. Of course, there will be a high participation of, once again, electrical workers and more on the engineering side. But those, how many, what that's going to involve, both on cost and on who's going to be doing it and what skills are needed. It's just it spans so many activities, and I think that we really need to get to grips with. That's probably more in next, it will be really gearing up right through the next decade, in the 2030s. But I think we need to be starting to prepare for that now, really. Yeah, that would be my short answer for it.
Thank you, Jay. Brad, if you would like to turn your camera on and your microphone on and introduce yourself and your question.
Thanks. I'll leave my camera off. We've got storms over here at the moment. My bandwidth is a bit flaky, so if I can leave the camera off, that would be appreciated. To my earlier question, the discussion about long-term training requirements is important, but looking at the numbers that you presented earlier on, we've got this massive ramp up before 2030, which is well within the time frame of new trainees starting and getting a year or two of experience or additional training in specialist areas, specifically, say, for electricians that want to work then on wind farms or large facilities or transmission or whatever. Where do we see those resources coming from to achieve just even the step change requirement between now and 2029?
I'd just like to add to that. I know we're having, I think the work that ETU and the Powering Skills doing is really fantastic. But is there also an issue with retention of people in the industry as well as completions?
I might take that as a comment because Sam had turned off her microphone, and I'd like to hear AEMO's thoughts if they have on this.
Oh, thanks. Look, I think we can come back to Jay's point. I agree. It's important. In response to the question, I think that the question you're asking is probably something that needs to be asked to governments, I guess, because we're producing these kind of materials and these projections in order to provide transparency about the kind of requirements that come behind the transition and the projections that we're seeing. So I don't think that I don't think that maybe ISF, I'm not sure, but I know that AEMO doesn't have a specific view on exactly where these workers are going to come from. The reason that we're so interested to produce this report and to look at it and to discuss it is to give a piece of material that shows the nature of the challenge and gives some substance to these kind of discussions that can be had with policymakers and can be had with industry groups and can be had, you know, amongst developers and amongst people who are trying to achieve these, you know, progress these projects. So I don't know if that, I think that the answer is not necessarily known across all states and all jurisdictions. I think there are some programs underway by some governments and some industry players as well will need to be part of it. But I don't think that there's a specific answer that we can give you.
And I think one thing that just to build on Sam's comments, this came up in the industry reference group that acts as a guiding body for all of the Race for 2030 projects. And one of the items that was discussed as part of that is really the purpose of the ISP and the sensitivity that Jay mentioned earlier, which was around understanding what would happen to the deliverability of the ISP if you started to put in shortfalls around the availability of not just workers but also supply chain issues. And the outcome of that sensitivity analysis was that the emissions reduction targets that were set by government couldn't be met. And that was really one of the conditions that guides what the ISP says is if we have these emissions reductions targets, what is required to meet them? And so really Sam's comments around going back to governments and having a conversation about what the outcome of both the ISP generally, but about this additional piece of work, which was a requirement from AEMO's ISP to do this piece of work, what that says about the deliverability of those targets. David Ponting from API has put on his camera, so I'm wondering if he might have a question or something to add at this point, and then we'll go to Nick, who has also put a comment in.
Thanks. No comment, really. I've had my camera on the whole time. I like to see everyone, but I suppose our interest is very much on the technical professional workforce in the transmission space. And I know that's a small part of it, but the lead time for us as, you know, sort of engineering professionals, that's more like an 8-year time frame in terms of being a competent professional. So 4 years of training, 4 years of graduate development. Do you see that as an issue in your timelines there? Like the numbers aren't huge, but we do have a shortfall of those engineering type skill sets.
I think there's quite a few occupations that are small in numbers but are critical. So I think both across the professional but also more the trade. So I think there's some crane drivers, for example, that are very short supply. I think certainly the transmission build is soon, and that is a big kind of spike that's needed. I wouldn't know whether there's social license issues, there's workforce issues. I think there's a few obstacles to that, and I guess again this comes to how can government interact with this, really, about both increasing professional development courses, but also working to accelerate that actual implementation. And I think that comes across really a lot of these issues that it's, as Sam said, we're trying to provide the information, but really it's some of this really does need policy And it is hard, like we really don't have much time for implementation now. Our window is getting shorter. So it's challenging. And it's great to see that there are a lot of initiatives, both in industry and government to specifically look at workforce issues. Yeah, it is a challenge. And it's global, every other country is also grappling with things.
Just on that, with your recommendation number 3, I think it was about in terms of 10% of projects having early development workforce. I can't remember but in past experiences I've had dealing with this with Engineers Australia, a lot of those conditions are very much on the vet workforce, and they don't consider the undergraduate experience component. So, and that's where we do see a pinch point with cost of living and other things. So as an example, at the moment, 80% of engineering students in Australia, 80%, 4 out of 5, will take more than 4 years to do a 4-year degree because they have to drop their load in order to work, in order to earn. And if they're doing unpaid summer placements that they need to do, that further exacerbates the problem. So if we can actually get work placements that are paid work placements as part of those projects, then you will remove a barrier, but also the rate of pay is generally quite good that it can help them progress through faster. So, yeah.
Thanks very much for that comment, David. I'll just jump in here because it relates to a comment from Dylan, who has talked to whether this question might be beyond the scope, and I know that it is mentioned in the report as an implication of the outcomes of the research. But what about the potential cost implications of this huge requirement on an increased size of the workforce, and how does it flow through to the ISP? And talking here about the natural implication of what David's been talking to in terms of higher labour costs, which in turn might increase costs for projects, but of course, cost of living can impact the supply of labour as well. Any comments?
That was actually just what I was going to comment on before you read. I hadn't looked in the chat, but I think the implication of some of this is doing those training programs does put the cost up. And also we've said part of why it's so challenging is that renewable energy is frequently a bit lower paid than other sectors, certainly than mining. And if we are going to meet these requirements, we're going to have to poach workers from other sectors, and that will mean higher pay. And I think it's that we can't expect to do everything and have lowest cost, and that's not a popular outcome, but it's true. We can't deliver and have everything lowest cost, and I think that's just something we have to come to terms with.
Thanks very much, Jay. We are bang on the end of the hour, but I did say that I would come back to Nick's question. And this might be one that we want to end on as a slight panel, if Ben or Chris Briggs have anything to add to this, and that is around how many baby boomers are we about to lose from the workforce as well, that we need to start factoring into some of our projections for workforce challenges and shortages.
So
Jay's smiling. Ben,
while we were chatting, I looked up the census data. So 2021, a bit old, but for our purposes, it's fine. So just looking at electricians, because they're the biggest occupation, roughly 14% are aged over 55. So pretty minor compared to the national average. So I think one of the bigger concerns is that once someone starts their trade at a relatively young age, how do we then keep them within it? How do we tell, especially when we're attracting young people, how do we communicate the narrative to them that the trade is not the end point, but it's just the start of your career within the energy sector? And that is something that, again, we'll be exploring in the 2025 Workforce Plan, which comes out on March, available on the Powering Skills website. So the oldness, not the biggest issue, but the broader retention. and how do we move people through the sector into, and then communicating there are options through the sector, is probably something that's maybe a bit more of an issue than age at this point in time.
Thank you, Ben, and a wonderful point to finish on. Thanks to everyone here who is presumably in the energy sector. Don't leave us. There's a lot that you can do in this space. And bring your friends. We want more people to join us in the energy sector. Thanks very much to Ben from Powering Skills Organisation for joining us on what's turned into an informal panel session. Please make sure that you sign up for their newsletter and Insights webinars. If you like today's presentation, please also sign up to RACE's newsletters. The new one will be coming out in the next couple of weeks that profiles the projects that we're working on and where we're looking for new partners. Thanks very much, UTS ISF. They also have a webinar, a newsletter list. We will see if we can add links to all of those when we send out a link to the webinar. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.